All right, so we should be live, class, and I'm glad that you're here to join us once again, or join me once again for our contemporary Christian philosophers of significance, our course here. Now, we have the wonderful privilege of having with us today Dr. Tim McGrew. He is at Western Michigan University. He's the professor and chair of philosophy at Western Michigan. He received his PhD at Vandy or Vanderbilt, for those of you not in the know. Uh, and I'm not sure where he did his undergrad. We may get to that in a second, but he's also spoken at Oxford. He's spoken at MIT. He has helped to prep uh, the William Lane Craig for multiple debates. And he's also, just a fun fact, he's also a chess master, literally a chess master. Um, he's also I believe, the founder of the Library of Historical Apologetics. I know that he was very influential in that, if not just the founder of it in total. I've actually utilized that resource a few times myself. So, with that said, this is a philosopher that makes other philosophers nervous. So, thanks, Tim, for being with us today.
Thanks, Russell. I'm not sure about that nervous line. Now, what does the class think of me? Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Oh well. Yeah, I just want you definitely need recognition, and so just as the point of this class is called, Christian philosophers, contemporary Christian philosophers of significance. In my estimation, you are one of the most influential Christian thinkers that we have, though you are for the most part behind the scenes on a certain level. That's not to say that you aren't making significant impact. Otherwise, I wouldn't even have been so privileged to have you here with us today. So, having said that, is there anything that you want to clarify that I may have gotten wrong in your intro there?
No, you did leave out the incredibly important fact that I am good at making paper airplanes. But
That
other than that, I think we're good.
Now I did forget about that, and I knew that, but I forgot to toss that in there, so I should have said that.
Toss is the operative word. Yeah.
Okay, all right. I walked right into that one. Okay, good stuff. All right, so let's get right into this. I'm just going to ask Dr. McGrew here a few questions. If any of you guys, watching in the course want to take notes, and that's obviously fine. In fact, I recommend you do that. So here we go with our first question for Dr. McGrew. And these are going to be some softballs for the most part to get things rolling. Now, what initially drew you, Dr. McGrew, into, say, the study of philosophy, maybe even formally, but then even informally? What drew you into that?
So that's a great question. A combination of factors, really. For one thing, I was a library geek. I was hanging out in our local library from the time that I could ride my bike down there by myself. And so I was always browsing the shelves, pulling off books on all kinds of different topics. I read my way through the science fiction section. I was reading books on calligraphy and cryptanalysis and chess and anything I could find. So I ran across some philosophy books there and thought they were quite fascinating. And that piqued my interest a little bit, but I still didn't realize how much there was to study there. But I was raised in a Christian home and always took my Christianity seriously. And in high school, like many people, I started wondering, well, but do we really know that this is true? And I discovered that in order to answer skeptical questions, you had to know some philosophy. So I switched libraries to the college library. My father was a Bible college professor, and they had quite a good philosophy section there. And I took the time to look through that section and began realizing, wow, if I want to be able to answer challenges to my faith all the way down to the ground, this is the field that I need to go into. And so it was at that point that I realized philosophy was going to become a vocation for me.
Awesome. So would you say that it's fair to say that, at least in a loose sense, there was an apologetic sort of underpinning that was driving your desire to learn philosophy?
I would, but only in a loose sense, and that in this sense. When I began my inquiry, it was an open possibility that Christianity might turn out not to be rationally justifiable.
Hmm.
And if that was going to happen, then I was going to have to face up to that. So
Right.
I didn't enter it saying, well, by hook or crook, I'll find some way to justify what I currently believe. I entered it saying I really want to know whether this can stand up to rational examination. Fortunately, I discovered that it can and more, but I didn't enter it for the purpose of just like covering over any insufficiencies in my belief with good feelings and sort of pseudo intellectual air. I really wanted to know the truth.
Sure, sure. Now, we didn't get to the undergrad, and this may come into that. Did you go directly into your undergrad studying philosophy as well, or how'd that work?
I did not. I attended the Bible college where my father taught for 2 years. I got a tuition break there, and we were not very wealthy, so that was helpful.
Hmm.
And after 2 years, I transferred to a local university, a Catholic school, actually, the University of Scranton in Scranton, Pennsylvania. And they took for transfer credit every course of mine that did not have the word Baptist in the title. It's very funny, but that's fine. And so, I got in to the Catholic school and did a philosophy major there. But I had really not much by way of formal training in philosophy before I made that jump.
Okay, that's cool. Now, just as an aside, did R.C. Sproul have anything to do at the University of Scranton?
If he did, I'm unaware of it.
All right, fair enough. Now, next question: what would your thoughts be? This is kind of the perennial, question that every philosopher has to deal with that's a Christian, and even I would say a non-Christian. Even non-Christians touch on this area, um, and both have their angles they're going to approach this. But the next question might be: what are your thoughts regarding the question of faith and reason? Is there a relationship between faith and reason? Is faith and reason categories that are completely distinct, almost something like the Noma position, or are they intertwined, or are they just friendly with each other? How do you work this out? What do you think the relationship is between
Right.
faith and reason?
So Thomas Aquinas has a picture of the relationship between faith and reason that I think is useful. And you can think of it as two circles partly overlapping. There are truths that you can know by reason alone. That's one of the circles. There are truths that you are shown by revelation. I'll talk about that in a minute. Those two overlap. And where they overlap, you can check and see whether they're telling you the same thing. And in fact, they are. And so I think there's a consistent picture here. But there are things that reason unaided by revelation, by special revelation, cannot tell you. So I think general revelation and the application of our reason is sufficient to tell us that there is a God. It is not sufficient to tell me whether my sins are forgiven. That's a different level, and I need other kind of evidence for that. But I use evidence even when I'm assessing special revelation, when I'm looking at scripture, when I'm interpreting it, when I'm trying to decide what counts as scripture. Right? There are many holy books. Is it the Bhagavad Gita or the Upanishads or the Quran or the Book of Mormon, or which book shall I turn to? I need a touchstone. I need to be able to determine that. That is determined in the same way that I would determine whether a historian is telling me the truth, whether the Roman historian Tacitus or the Jewish historian Josephus is telling me the truth. I approach that with the kinds of tools that are appropriate to that kind of inquiry. And when I find the truth there, I have the kind of confidence that historical inquiry can give. Maybe it would be useful at this point just to hit pause and say, the way that I use the word faith, faith is at bottom trust. That's actually the root meaning of the Greek word that's used in the New Testament for faith, pistis. It means trust, and trust can be well placed or poorly placed. And so I think biblical faith is well-placed trust in matters of some consequence. So I'm taking things I care about, consequences I care about, and they are out of my control, but I am basing my trust on some things that I know. So biblical faith is never blind. No one is ever commended for blind faith or asked to have blind faith. And I can get a whole bunch of quotations on that subject if you want, but that's there's a harmony between faith and reason that is not the priority of one over the other, in some sense that there's people who prioritize what they call faith. Sometimes that's associated with Tertullian. I'm not sure that he actually would have recognized it, but that's an idea that is put forward. Some people prioritize reason over faith in some strong sense that their faith becomes sort of just bumping along rider afterward. I think there's a harmony of these two, and I think they converge. So in a book written a few years ago called Four Views on Christianity and Philosophy, I maintained the position that there's convergence between reason and faith, between Christianity and philosophy, that philosophy supports Christianity and Christianity completes philosophy, shows us things that we need to know, that we'd like to know, that philosophy, unaided by special revelation, is unable to determine.
All right. And so it sounds like that when obviously I lean Thomist. And so the minute you bring up Aquinas and start to talk about the categories and that and as related in that sense, I'm obviously completely on board. Now, here's something. What might you say to this? And just like you said, we can back this particular view up of faith and reason, not revelation over reason, not reason over revelation, but this nice complementary aspect there. And then, of course, as Aquinas would say, philosophy being the handmaiden of theology in some sense. But what might you say, Dr. McGrew, to someone who says, wait a minute. You stated that there's no example of the believer being rewarded for some sort of fideism, right? For some sort of just leap into the dark or whatever. But what about this scripture where Christ tells Thomas, blessed are those that will believe without seeing. What might we say to someone like that?
Seeing is only one way to have evidence. There are other ways to have evidence. Thomas himself had evidence. He had the evidence of trustworthy people he knew well telling him they had seen the Lord. I mean, it was a striking and rather shocking pronouncement, but there were many of them. They doubtless had details that they could tell him about it. What was his response? I won't believe unless I see him for myself. Well, I mean, where would we get in science if we took that view? I won't believe in electrons until I see them. Well, you can't see them. They're too small. Light waves step right over them. Well, then I won't believe in them. We do have evidence for the existence of electrons. I won't believe in black holes until I see one. Sorry, sweetheart, you're out of luck. Black holes have gravity so great that light can't escape from the surface, so you literally can't see them. But what you can see is stars down near the center of our galaxy spiraling into some space where you can't see anything. Their behavior is best explained by the existence of a black hole. So there are lots of things we can't see, but we have good reason to believe in, and we run into this in science constantly. It's just not reasonable to draw the line right there, because that's not where reason stops. So I would say what Thomas is being chided for, and what people are being commended for who believe without having seen, is not the abandonment of their reason. It's the use of their reason even when seeing the thing isn't involved.
Okay. And I think that's usually, a more than sufficient response, because I think that as you acknowledge there and as you point to, that Jesus is not necessarily saying, blessed is the man who has zero evidence.
Not at all.
He doesn't say that at all. He just says, blessed is the guy who's obviously not, he doesn't have his skeptical meter all the way up to his highest to where you have at this point in time. Of course, we could do the entire interview or discussion with that, but we're not going to.
Okay.
Anything you want to toss in there before we go to the next question?
No, your hand is on the steering wheel of this one. I'll just let you guide it where you like.
Yeah, that's a dangerous thing. That's a dangerous thing. All right. So, and this next question, if you want to take this one particular direction, but then go off on tangents on this, then that's completely open, because you may see this as a loaded question. You may not see this as simply as black and white as I'm about to portray it here, or as I'm about to ask it. But the question is, in your opinion, what is the greatest outside threat to Christian faith in the modern era? And this may give you some food. This may give you something to chew on, just to give you a trajectory that you may want to go. I know that J.P. Moreland, in his new book, Scientism, he kind of takes the lead of Dallas Willard there, saying that, look, scientism, right, and he means something like naturalism in a sense, is the greatest threat, because all of these other threats are born out of this view of naturalism, this metaphysical naturalism kind of thing. Would you agree with that, or would you kind of take a different course of action, or would you say it's a combination of things?
I would say it depends on what you mean by threat, because there are different kinds of threats. There are external threats, and I think a rising tide of scientism is an intellectual threat. I think a rising tide of social attacks on the morality of Christianity and sort of the Christian remnants of morality in our culture is another kind of threat, a very different one. Culture is collapsing around us. 10 years ago, how many of us would have predicted these changes? I remember when it was the hot issue on life ethics to try to overturn Roe v. Wade. That was really an important thing, that the highest good that we could imagine. Now we can't even get the U.S. Congress to vote to protect infants who are born alive.
Yeah.
I remember when not long ago, the hot issue on sexual ethics was, holding the line on a traditional definition of marriage. Now we've got the federal government telling us that we can't even decide for ourselves which people are men and which people are women, and they've got to be, entitled to select their own pronouns, and we've got to let them into the bathroom of their choice, and they can get into sporting events. And this is wow. This has really spiraled fast.
So would you say that this is an ideological threat? This aspect
I think that it is. Look at it this way. Whatever your particular political allegiances are, you got to be a little bit shocked that a former vice president of the United States wasn't allowed to get away with saying of Mike Pence that he's a decent guy.
Mm-hmm.
He was attacked so savagely for that he walked it back. Okay, all right, he's not a decent guy. Mike Pence makes Boy Scouts look like the scruffy guys out behind the gym smoking.
Yeah.
Mike Pence is as straight and narrow as they come, and you can't even say he's a decent guy. So this kind of attack is not designed to say that Christian morals and ideals are false. Instead, it's designed to say that they're bad, they're evil, they're bigoted, they're ugly. And so it calls for a different kind of response than a learned argument in defense of the resurrection of Jesus. Plenty of people now will say, I really don't care if Jesus rose from the dead. If this is your God, if this religion is your religion, I want nothing to do with it.
So what might your response be to an individual like that? Let's say that we are having a conversation, you and I are at the coffee shop, and we're discussing this particular issue with the person across the table on the other side of the couch. And let's say that they do realize that you have come to your belief, right, in Christ, not obviously via the Holy Spirit, but then too through reason and evidence and trying to think this thing through. And then we lay out some sort of case as to why we think that Christianity is not just possible, but plausible. And then they say, well, you know what? Even if that is true, this moral code or these things that you have to believe as a Christian are just so abhorrent that I don't even care if it's true. What might you say to that person?
I'd say I think you need to take another look at what the moral code actually is, and I think you need to ask some questions about your own foundations for morality. So, people who go full-bore naturalism, there's a physical universe out there. Consciousness is a late arrival on the scene. It's ephemeral. Ultimately, it's going to die a heat death. I want to say to them, you value certain things. But why? When someone gives an account of the origin of something that makes it impossible for that thing to have the value he places upon it, he has a problem.
Sure.
So if someone values, let's just say, human equality, right? Very few people, and very scary people, when we occasionally encounter them, are openly waving a flag saying, yes, I like racism. I'm a supporter of race. You're like, wow, where did that come from? We don't run into a lot of people like that. Most people will say, well, yeah, no, of course, I'm not in favor of illicit discrimination on the basis of, physical characteristics of that kind. That's just not cool. Okay. Why not? Most of history has seen more powerful peoples enslaving less powerful peoples.
Right.
Happens all the time, and it happens across lines that we would consider to be ethnic or color lines. It's a mess. Aristotle himself thought some people were sort of naturally fitted out to be subjugated and to serve the role of slaves.
Right.
Not a pretty picture.
So would you try then? Would you say that it's fair that what you're trying to do at that point is just tease out the logical implication of the other person's worldview at that point?
That's one part of it. But then I would also come back and I would say, now consider what a change Christianity brought. So, for example, many people don't know this, but there's a Jewish morning prayer that a man would say in which he thanks the master of the universe that he is not a barbarian, thanks the master of the universe that he is not a woman, thanks the master of the universe that he is not a slave. It's a Jewish prayer. And along comes St. Paul in Galatians 3, and he says, in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither male nor female. There is neither slave nor free man. We are one. That is a phenomenal statement for a Jewish rabbi to make.
Sure.
He is taking that prayer and he's turning it on its head and saying, no, and no, and no, you have misunderstood. None of these things gives you any position of privilege before God. We stand on an equal footing here. That is remarkable. If you read Vishal Mangalwadi's book, he's got a wonderful book called The Book That Made Your World. He's a social reformer in India. And he tells you about the kinds of things that are going on in India. Unwanted children, not just, fetuses, not just when they're first born, but 12 years old are being killed by their parents. We don't need another mouth to feed.
Mhm.
Or sold into prostitution. And he talks about the difference that Scripture makes and that Christianity makes as he has seen it in his culture. If you value these things, then you value things that require some kind of foundation. The more you look into it, I believe, the more you will see that Christianity provides exactly the foundation required for these things to have the values that you instinctively know they do,
Right.
and nothing else does.
Right. So I think that it's probably safe to say then that um, because I hold this view as well that probably the greatest external threat to the Christian faith is this ideological belief that one, either Christianity is just false, and then there's just no bones about trying to make that point, hence the new atheists and whatnot, or that even if something like Christianity is true, that it is an ancient, outdated relic in regard to moral positions and moral code and whatnot. Safe to say?
Yeah, and not just outdated, but actually, visibly horrific,
Right, right. Immoral, right.
immoral in ways that are gross and that all right-thinking people should abandon. Those are the external threats. There is, however,
Sure.
also an internal threat.
I was
Uh,
just about to say, what do you think as a Christian thinker? What do you think probably one
yeah,
of the greatest internal threats to Christianity may be?
I think the greatest internal threat to Christianity is that Christians haven't the faintest idea why they believe what they believe.
All right. Okay. You want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, so way back in the early 1800s, William Wilberforce, the guy who throughout his life crusaded to eliminate slavery in England, wrote a book called A Practical View of the Prevailing Religious System of Professed Christians in the higher and middle classes in this country, contrasted with real Christianity. Mouthful of a title. Uh, but
As they all were.
he starts it off saying that Christians aren't studying the reasons for their own faith. I'll read you a quotation from it.
Yeah.
In an age wherein it is confessed and lamented that infidelity abounds, do we observe in them, that is, in the Christians, any remarkable care to instruct their children in the principles of the faith which they profess, and to furnish them with arguments for the defense of it? They would blush on their child's coming out into the world to think him defective in any branch of that knowledge of those accomplishments which belong to his station in life, and accordingly these are cultivated with becoming assiduity. Right? We send them to school so that
Right.
they speak well, they have manners, but he is left to collect his religion as he may. The study of Christianity has formed no part of his education, and his attachment to it, where there any attachment to it exists at all, is too often not the preference of sober reason and conviction, but merely the result of early and groundless prepossession. He believes it because he was taught it. He was born in a Christian country. Of course, he's a Christian. His father was a member of the Church of England. So is he. When such religion is handed down among us by hereditary succession, says Wilberforce, it cannot surprise us to observe young men of sense and spirit beginning to doubt altogether the truth of the system in which they have been brought up and ready to abandon a station which they are unable to defend. They have no idea why they should be Christians. As my friend Frank Turek likes to put it, they're talked out of it because they've never been talked into it.
All right. Yeah, his intro to his podcast there. That's right.
And trust me, I'm a college professor at a secular university campus. I see the end result of this. Students who come to the university, they're hit with objections they had no idea existed, and then they implode.
Right.
So that's a sad sight.
So speaking to that, just very quickly, you being at a secular university, and I'm also at a secular university just across the street here, does it strike you as, because this is something I've noticed, that when the Christians that do want to try and defend their faith, the Christians that do want to try and say, oh, well, hey, wait, slow down, wait a minute. When they do offer up some sort of defense, this is anecdotal, this has just been in my experience, and let me know what you think in your experience as well, but it's been abysmal. They'll immediately give up, say, a classical attribute of God's, any of the omnis to try to get out of a particular problem. They'll say things like, I had a student just yesterday say, well, we know God made, mistakes. And so, that things of that nature, is that also something, is that germane just to West Georgia, my region, or is that something?
Only, no. Yeah, I believe the Babylon Bee has one of their pieces. Like, does anyone else have a piece of blatant Christological heresy they'd like to share? Right? Yeah. No, this is again both a symptom and a result of our failure to do discipleship of the mind.
Right.
When Jesus is telling us the greatest commandment, he says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. And we tend to just leave that mind bit out of it. I want to say, go back and reread Matthew 22, people. There's this thing you need to see there. But we leave that out, and we think it's okay if you have good manners.
Right.
We all know there's a kind of a debased sense of the word Christian that just means polite person.
Right, sweet boy.
Right. Oh, he's a good Christian lad, and
Right.
That's not what it means to be a Christian.
Right.
And so when we leave that out and when we put substitutes in for it that are poor substitutes that should never have been placed in that position, then we're really just leaving ourselves wide open for a takeover.
Sure.
It's like having a castle that's got a wall and a gate and a drawbridge, and you lower the drawbridge, open the gate, and just let the enemy march right in.
Right. We could take that right now to a hot button political issue on one side of the country right now, but we're just not going to, we won't go there. But good point. Now, let's get back into some more deep philosophical matters here. Now, Dr. McGrew here with us is obviously a astute Christian thinker, but one of his areas of academic expertise has been in the last 15 years or so. It's been adopted into a few different apologetic methodologies, specifically what we would call evidentialism, and that is Bayes' theorem. Now, especially in light of an argument for the resurrection. Now, Dr. McGrew here before us is literally, and I'm not ashamed to say, one of the most astute thinkers and how do I want to say this? I'll just say teacher of Bayes' theorem. Now, most of us here, right, in this particular class are going to have heard of Bayes' theorem and hopefully have interacted with in some sense. But Dr. McGrew, if you just had before you an intelligent layman, right, who maybe has had some training, but not necessarily an expert in these types of things, how would you explain the enigmatic Bayes' theorem to the average intelligent
Yeah, it's a
individual.
little bit like saying, please explain the Pythagorean theorem without math. But I'll give it a try.
Yeah, here we
So
go.
Bayes' theorem is basically a device that coordinates the probabilities that we give to things. If I say, I think the Patriots have a 20% chance of winning the Super Bowl next year, but I think that they've got a 90% chance of not winning the Super Bowl, I have a problem. 20% and 90% add up to more than 100%. Something
Right,
went wrong here, right?
right.
That it's true and that it's false. So there are principles that organize our probabilities, and then there are some rules that show us very compelling ways of changing our minds and readjusting the probabilities that we give to things when we get new information. Bayes' theorem is at the heart of that. Without going into any equations, without writing something on a whiteboard and then turning it around and
Right.
showing it to you, I guess maybe the simplest way to explain it would be to say it's a little bit like taking a theory for a test drive, right? Suppose you want to buy a car, and where you live, there's a fair amount of snow and ice. So on a snowy, icy day, you go out and you drive a couple of cars, you see how they handle, right? Do they do well? Are they skidding all over the road? Do you feel safe in them? You figure out how it performs vis-a-vis the conditions that you know you've got.
Right.
And some are going to perform better than others. No sensible person says, wow, this car was skidding all over the map. I had no control. It's the one I want to buy. Nobody does that. We say, I prefer something that's got, I really like that four-wheel drive thing there. I know it's a little more pricey, but I think that may be where I'm going to go. We see how they do with regard to the conditions that we know we have. Similarly, when we're checking out some hypotheses to try perhaps to explain a piece of evidence or a whole body of evidence, we take it for a test drive. We say, how well does it explain the evidence? Some hypotheses explain the evidence really well, others not so much. And some hypotheses come, so to speak, come cheap, or they don't cost us too much. If we can find a hypothesis that's not too costly, that's not too implausible on its face, and that also does a really good job with the evidence we have, fabulous, then that's the way to go. When it does a really good job with the evidence, but it wasn't sort of very highly ranked initially, then we have some trade-offs, and we have to try to navigate that space of trade-offs and say, well, is it doing really well with the evidence, the thing that most matters, or is it prior plausibility that most matters? So sometimes those considerations can pull us in opposite directions, just like the price of a car and how well it handles may pull us in opposite directions. Wow, I love the way this feels on the road, but it was really a little bit out of the price range I'd hoped to hit. And so we negotiate that, we figure out where we fall on that. Bayes' theorem is a tool for doing that with hypotheses and evidence that has some really beautiful, rigorous mathematical backing and enables us to make these intellectual trade-offs in a principled way. So that's what it does for us. And it does it with a little bit of high school math. I promise you can understand Bayes' theorem with just addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and a little bit of new notation, and you're good to go. But that would take more time than we have here, and
Sure.
you didn't ask me to do the math, so I'm out on that. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And of course, there are people that have employed Bayes' theorem in arguments. I think that it's kind of a people see math and they immediately, go into some sort of shock. But I know that William Lane Craig at one time was using Bayes' theorem in his argument for the resurrection. I know that Licona was at one time using Bayes' theorem in some
I
sense.
think Mike Licona was less inclined to use it. Bill did use it in his debate with Bart Ehrman, and it shows up in the third edition of Bill's book, Reasonable Faith.
That's right. That's right. And then there's been some that have tried to attack even the Tim McGrew in regards to somebody like Richard Carrier that would say that Dr. McGrew didn't know how to employ Bayes' theorem, which if you know Dr. McGrew, um, you better be careful saying something like that when somebody, we'll just leave that at that. We'll just leave that at that.
As I recall, Richard ended up apologizing and saying he was wrong about that. Yes.
Well, that's great to know. I'm glad to know that. I'm glad the students get to hear that too, just in case they do run across that. And I'm not afraid to use scare quotes here. Critique offered by Carrier there.
Right. The deal with Bayes' theorem is that it's like so many things, it's a garbage in, garbage out thing. Even pure deductive logic, you start off with the wrong premises. Nobody can guarantee that you will not wind up with falsehoods.
Right, right.
With Bayes' theorem, you start off with wildly crazy numbers and you can wind up in crazy territory. That's just, nothing is more likely than that you will go off the rails if you put the wrong things in. So it's a tool, it coordinates probabilities, but by itself, it doesn't tell us what the initial input values should be. And
Right.
for that, we do things like historical research. We do the normal kinds of things that are appropriate to the kind of questions that we have.
Right. Or to find the truthfulness of any normal deductive premise, right? Or deductive
Right.
syllogism, right? Just we have
You
to
roll up
look
your
at the
sleeves, you
premise.
do your work, you check it out, and when you're confident that it's true, then you know what you can do with it in an inference. But Bayes'
Right.
theorem can be sadly misused, and you can get some really crazy things coming out when people
Right.
misuse it.
Logic can never be misused. So why would we think that Bayes' theorem
Yeah,
could ever be misused?
like cars, right? Nobody ever misuses cars or guns.
No, you
So
could never misuse.
clearly, what's the problem, right?
Right,
Yeah,
you
no,
couldn't do that.
all of these things require responsible handling. Yes.
Right, that's right. All right, so we're coming up on the last question, unless we find some awesome rabbit trail to go on, and that would be this: we're back deep into philosophy again, which appropriately is where we need to be in this for the course. But you kind of have a different take a on your epistemology in regards to the Christian faith. So one of the popular approaches to epistemology right now in regards to Christian faith is sometimes called Reformed epistemology. Sometimes, and correct me here if I'm wrong, but I want to say that even Dr. Craig adopts some sort of variation of a Reformed epistemology, if I'm not mistaken, and you can correct me on that as we get into it later if you need to. But what is your view? How do we know things, Dr. McGrew? And then how do you incorporate that into your walk with God or our knowledge of God, so to speak? You can parse those out if you need to there.
Yeah. So just I'll back all the way down to the ground here and say um, there are some things that we know without reasoning our way to them from other things.
Right.
When I have a headache, I know that I have a headache, and I don't arrive at that belief by some process of inference. It's not like I look in the mirror and I see my bloodshot eyes and my flushed brow, and I see the bottle of Tylenol clenched in my trembling hand, and I say, by golly, I must have a headache.
Right. And so for the students here, what epistemology are you thereby ruling out?
So that, well, it's a version of foundationalism, and that would rule out what are known as versions of epistemic coherentism, according to which there's no stopping place. There are no things that we know just in virtue of a direct acquaintance. We always infer everything that we know. That position, I think, is a mistake. There are some things that we know without inference. Everything else that we know is justified ultimately in terms of some things that we know without inference. There's a lot of reasoning, a lot of inference going on. We explain things, we extrapolate things, and so forth. But fundamentally, there are some things that we just know directly, and then other things we know by inference from them. Now, where I would differ strongly from the Reformed epistemologists is that I think their idea of what we know directly is just much too expansive. There are things they think we know directly, like the great truths of the gospel,
Right.
which I don't think anybody could know directly in any way that I've ever experienced. And I suspect many other people also have not experienced anything that would give them direct knowledge of those things. Am I saying God couldn't communicate them directly to someone in some mystical way? I'm not saying that. What do I know? But that's not the way that I'm wired. I respond to evidence that I possess. And so the way that I approach these things, my evidentialism, as you said, is that I think that things like the resurrection of Jesus and the trustworthiness of the Gospels are things that we arrive at by a process of reasoning from things that we do know, which can form a kind of a common ground in discussion between us and unbelievers. And so I look for that common ground. Sometimes it's hard to find. People are not always consistent in where they stand. Sometimes you push them on one thing and they'll shift ground, and suddenly they're coming from a different angle, and you just feel like you're trying to wrestle with a fog bank. But I do think that there is ultimately common ground. So in that regard, I would distance myself quite sharply from the presuppositional school of thought, Cornelius Van Til,
Sure.
and today people like
which
Scott Oliver.
is which is strictly a religious epistemology. Well, they would say that it's not, but you would classify that as basically a religious type of epistemology. That's how I would classify it.
I wouldn't know how else to classify it. There's
Right.
nobody who has the slightest interest in it, who is not in the Reformed tradition. I mean, that's
Right.
kind of the part of that package
Right. That's
that you
what.
get.
Yeah.
And there are plenty of people in the Reformed tradition who are totally evidential.
Right.
People like Thomas Chalmers and B.B. Warfield, R.C. Sproul.
Right.
Who
Or
want,
classicalists, right?
right,
Like Sproul and so on.
right,
That's
who
right.
want nothing to do with, they're broadly evidential. Classical Christian apologetics is evidential in the very broad sense in which I'm using it here.
Right.
It's
Sure.
evidence based, right? We go for the evidence.
All right. We're
There
going to
are,
get an argument right here, class. You're about to see us get an argument.
yeah. So, but I just don't think that even the claim that God exists is something that I can know without inference. Fortunately, as Paul says in Romans 1, plenty of evidence for the existence
Sure.
and some of the attributes of God, his eternal power and Godhead are seen. How? By the things that are made.
Right.
Right? That's how we come to know these things. We look up into the sky, we look into the microscope, we say, okay, not by chance.
One of the problems, tell me if you think this is a fair assessment, and we're not going to get super deep into critiques of different epistemologies here because we're just trying to introduce, students in this course to contemporary Christian thinkers. But and tell me if you think this is fair, but one of my difficulties with Reformed epistemology is that it really comes across as very subjective to me as to what each individual considers a properly basic belief in some sense. And of course, this goes back to Plantinga's example of, or really the critique against Plantinga of the great pumpkin type objection. Even though that's been answered, by Plantinga, it still seems to be somewhat subjective about what, if Reformed epistemology is true, if it's adopted, that it still seems to be open to the charge of it being a bit subjective to each individual.
I know what you're saying, and I know why they would object to it. Of course, they're going to say,
Sure.
no, it is grounded in the way that you really are made and whether you really are functioning properly, your belief-forming modules of your mind are functioning properly in the environment for which they're designed. That's objective fact, they would say. But
that seems to be begging the question in some sense.
I think that it is. And that being said, nothing prevents someone from making a parallel argument for Mormonism.
Right.
It's perfectly easy to do. If you look at how many Muslim apologists defend their beliefs, it's very much this, that we just take our stand on these things with which we start. And I see no reason why they couldn't adopt the Plantingian formalism.
Right.
All of this arises because the notion of a belief's being warranted in Plantinga is not equivalent to the idea of a belief's being justified in more traditional terms. For him, you can have a belief pop into your head totally to your surprise. And as long as it's been produced by a mechanism that produces a high proportion of truths over falsehoods, and that mechanism is operating the way it was designed to operate, you're good. So if benevolent spacefaring aliens drop into orbit around Earth and start beaming into your mind a whole bunch of beliefs about high energy particle physics, and you've never studied the subject, but you just find yourself believing, wow, that's the ground state of this isotope of oxygen or something, and you wonder why you're even believing it. As long as they're benevolent and they're producing this in a reliable fashion in your mind, you have warrant.
Right.
I find that a very unhelpful way to analyze epistemological concepts.
And plus, too, it just seems to be that's the very question: is how do you know that?
Right. Now,
So
suppose that I had a bunch of beliefs about the stock market and I'd never studied the stock market.
right,
I'd be baffled and I'd be a little scared for my sanity. Suppose then I began checking out how the stock market was doing, and I was waking up with beliefs about what would happen the following day, and I amassed a track record of correct predictions. The track record might justify me in believing that I was hooked into reality in some weird way that I couldn't explain that was giving me these things. The track record might do that. But I would not then move backwards from that and say, so, when I woke up and had the first of these crazy beliefs about what was going to happen to the stock of Microsoft, I knew it.
right.
No, I didn't know it. And if I know it now, it's in virtue of my having seen a track record of
Right.
success, not in virtue of the way that I just spontaneously happened to have it
Right.
predicted.
Which is exactly backwards.
Right.
Which is exactly backwards. And
Yeah.
so,
So that would be that's sort of the first steps in the kind of critique that I would lay out of
right.
that approach. But there are other able advocates of that view, and they've got their own things to say. And so I think
Absolutely. I mean, we both you and I both would be willing to say with great charity, and if he weren't so popular, I would have him on with the class to say that Alvin Plantinga is one of the greatest
absolutely.
influential, contemporary Christian thinkers and philosophers that we have at this moment.
That's indisputable.
Hmm.
But there are nevertheless, I think, very deep and troubling questions that arise when you really try to push that line of thought as far as it can go.
Right. At least in regards to epistemology there. So, well, Dr. McGrew, I've super enjoyed this time that we've got to speak with you. Is there anything at all that you would like to add or to say, maybe that we left out? Oh, maybe you would want to, well, maybe we can get into this another time. I was going to bring in when you were talking about the definition of faith and faith's relationship to reason. And maybe I'll just have to tell the students now to go check this out on their own. But you guys really need to look at Dr. McGrew had a debate a few years back. I remember I was working out, literally listening to this on like a podcast where Dr. McGrew debates Peter Boghossian, the guy who wrote How to Create an Atheist Skeptical kind of deal in regards to epistemology. Boghossian likes to call this street epistemology, and he likes to frame faith, the definition of faith for the Christian, as believing in things without reason at all, and maybe even in spite of evidence and reason. And Dr. McGrew and he literally have a debate over this. I believe it was on the Unbelievable radio show. Is that correct, Dr. McGrew?
That's right. It was about 5 years ago in the spring of 2014, I believe.
Okay.
We had that debate, and Justin and I both said we'd love to go round two if Peter would like to do it, but he's been too busy since then to come back and re-engage.
Right. Of course, he's been too busy. Of course, licking his wounds probably. So, if you guys want to check that out, that's in relation to the second question here. What are your thoughts regarding the perennial question of faith and reason? You'll be able to get a nice, robust view of Dr. McGrew's views in regard to faith and reason, and then what he believes faith to be. Right, the actual definition of faith. If you go check out that debate, Unbelievable radio program, Dr. McGrew versus Peter Boghossian, in debating faith and what faith is and how that relates to reason and epistemology and all those sorts of things. Just a really nice, fun kind of interaction there.
I thought it was fun.
Yeah, I thought I had a great time. I mean, well, I guess it depends on which side of the coin you're listening to the thing on. I had a great time. Maybe if you're a Boghossian advocate, maybe it wasn't necessarily so fun. But for this side of the equation, it seems to be, it was a blast. So having said that, last word, Dr. McGrew, anything you want to say?
We need people who will take questions of faith and reason seriously.
All right.
And if any of your students have an interest in pursuing these things further, I'm always available. You can share my email address with anybody who wants it. And I'm always happy to try to offer suggestions as time permits. Once in a while I get busy, so if I'm like silent for a week, don't despair. But these issues really matter, and we need a generation of people who will take them seriously, a few people, not everybody, but a few people should devote their lives to this kind of work. Maybe they won't become philosophers. Maybe they'll become historians. Maybe they'll become scientists. But we need people who have their eye on the ball of the relationship between what we believe as Christians and what we can tell is true in ordinary life. And so if anything that we've done today can encourage some of your students to do that, to support others who are doing that, that would be a great gain.
And even if they're pastors, they can inculcate this view into their congregation that these sorts of things matter.
Absolutely.
That these are important things. That when you hear a pastor back up certain positions and certain ideologies, that really has a large effect on their congregation. And so, you students that are going into the pastorate or some sort of ministry, just the fact that you're here and you're listening to this, and then you can show that this is important to the people in your congregation, even if they aren't necessarily involved in it directly, that they say, hey, this is a good thing that needs to be done. We need to support the kind of people that do this type of thing here.
Yeah.
So guys, check out Dr. McGrew's Library of Historical Apologetics. That's an unbelievable resource. I've been there a few times myself, like I said. And then also too, if you want to see some of Dr. McGrew's academic work, we didn't get time to mention that. I really wanted to, but Dr. McGrew has the write-up on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy regarding miracles. In fact, a few years ago, I was doing a presentation on miracles, and that was one of my key resources, was using his work there on nothing less than the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which you can queue up on the internet easily. That's the whole point of the SEP. And he actually wrote the article. A Christian thinker wrote the article on miracles and the possibility of miracles, and answers to David Hume and Spinoza and some of these other types of thinkers throughout the ages. We've got a representative from the faith on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So that's great. And I think he actually co-authored that with his wife's video. But you guys go check that out.
Actually, that one's my own. We co-authored the article on the resurrection for the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology.
That's right.
Yeah, so two things. It's a 2-for-1.
Right. And you guys have probably, if you're in this course, you've probably already had the Blackwell Companion as one of your textbooks. So maybe you're just now making a connection. Yeah, this is that guy who wrote that article. All right. So, or that essay there. All right. So thanks, Dr. McGrew. I hope to talk to you again sooner rather than later.
Thanks very much, Russell.
All right. Thanks.
Bye-bye.